at you. All right, let's go ahead and just dive in. This is a quote not from that time period, but from Marcus Garvey, which I really appreciate. And again, not from that time period, but just to drive home a point, this is a bottle of kava tincture. Some of you might be familiar with that herb. It's from the South Pacific, Polynesia, Tahiti, Hawaii, that part of the world. And this is a bottle that I have at home on my shelf. I found it in an antique store from Park Davis. So again, not the time period we're talking about, but just to drive home a point which we'll circle back to at the end. Park Davis, some of you may know, was the early to mid 20th century equivalent of Novartis, or take your pick of a big pharma company, right? And they were producing and selling herbal medicines. This was part of our everyday life and reality up until, you could say, the 1920s and 30s or so, where it kind of got cleaved, at least in terms of mainstream United States culture. But before that, as well as everywhere else in the world, or most places, I don't want to overgeneralize, as well as throughout our history, herbal medicine has always been part and parcel of what we've done for our health. Not that it has to be exclusive. I don't approach it at all dogmatically, by the way, but just to share that. And I like this quote because it's about remembering lost history. So I try to do that too, bring up some of the voices that have been lost, because it's really easy, if you're not very intentional about it, to make history all about one dead white man after another. And there's a lot of very interesting white men who did very important things, many of whom I'll mention today. But we have to keep that in the context that, the victors write the history, so to speak. And so a lot of voices get lost if you don't intentionally try to recover them. So just to preface a little bit of what I'll talk about too. And let's start with the people who were here first, right? Since ancient times, so much of the herbal remedies, so many of the herbal remedies that are popular today, think echinacea, black cohosh, right, a golden seal, herbs that if you use herbs at all, you've probably heard of, that they're native plants here. And it's not as if Europeans got here and figured out how to use them, right? They learned how to use them. They expanded on that for sure, but they learned how to use them from native peoples who are here, which is not always attributed as much as it should be. Of course, even more so exacerbated in our area, there are, of course, still Lenape people here in our region, but it was so early on that this area was colonized, that so many of the Lenape, those that survived smallpox and violence, were forced west to Oklahoma, Wisconsin, other areas. So quite a lot has been lost, right? And there are lots of good work being done to recover that too. And this is a quote from John Jocelyn, one of the first Englishmen, not the first, but one of the first Englishmen to pay attention to the plants growing here. You can imagine if you were a botanist in Europe and you got here and you're like, holy wow, like I don't know any of these. There's a whole continent of new plants to discover. Pretty exciting, along with some of the baggage that they brought with them too. But this is an interesting quote, which is quite common among the early Europeans who arrived here. There are not so many diseases reigning amongst them as our Europeans. This was really common description. Like, wow, they're healthy. They've got all their teeth. Their skin looks good. They're a lot taller than us, right? They live long, even to 100 years of age. If they be not cut off by war and the plague, which together with the smallpox, which of course we now know by best estimates killed more people than even the violence did, although there's an overlap between those two where it was purposely used that way. So we are in Lenapehoking, right? You're probably all of you or many of you familiar with this. We're towards the northern edge of Lenape territory here, right? So kind of up in there. I guess we're in the Neversink watershed here. If someone can correct me, down in Forestburgh where we live, we're in the Mungap. Both of those funnel into the Delaware. The Delaware was named for the first colonial governor of Virginia. It's the Lenape River. I'd love to see a rebranding effort happen. Lenape Sipu is one of the names for it, which basically means Lenape River. And there was a talk here recently, so I won't get into this, but there are sacred sites around us, sites that are lined with the equinoxes and solstices. There's a lot of very interesting archaeology that often gets ignored in terms of the Lenape heritage in our area. That's not our focus today, but I've been exploring some of that myself. And one thing I have been doing, which I'm happy to share if it's of interest, is gathering and compiling a spreadsheet of some of the Lenape names for our local and native plants, which I think is really important. And I'm compiling, I'm not the one doing that work, right? But I think it's important to recognize. All right. So, oh, someone got excited, right? So it's not uncommon for plants to be named for a person, but usually it's a botanist who first wrote it down, reported it to Carl Linnaeus or something like that, or somebody got honored by having the plant named for them. This is one of the few plants, the only one I can think of, honestly, that's named for a specific Native American person. And it's our local Joe Pye weed. Herbalists often call it gravel root because it's useful for addressing kidney stones, right? We're not getting into clinical stuff so much in this talk, but just to share that gravel is an old medical term for kidney stones. And but most wildflower people, that kind of thing, use the common name Joe Pye weed. These are Eupatorium species. There's several of them. They're now technically Eutrochium. If anyone's into plants and botany, you know what I'm getting at. If not, don't worry about it. But beautiful plants, get very tall, grow mostly in moist and wet environments. And so the question is, who was Joe Pye, right? And it's interesting, we'll probably never know all the facts just because of how long ago this was. Also the fact that he was Native American, right? A lot less is going to be written. That said, Joe Pye, which the best scholarly attempts at recreating this, think perhaps his name was Jopai or Jopi. And the best we can tell, this was Joseph, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation, so I apologize, but Joseph Shapkektukwat, also known as Joseph Pye. And Pye was not an uncommon last name at the time, particularly that Native Americans were adopting. They would often use an English name when that's the community they were interacting with, and their own true name in Algonquin or whatever language they spoke when they were in their own communities. But best we can tell, this was a Mohican healer, an herbalist, born in 1722. Here in the Northeast, he lived in the Hudson Valley for part of the time. Family kept getting pushed out and moved around as that was happening to Native communities in general, but actually quite well known for treating typhus, including among the colonist European and European descended communities, which actually got him, and again, the best we can tell historically, into some trouble with his own community in some cases. But he would work with both his own community and the colonist community. And you can read more about that if you're interested. And one thing that's always interested me or made me ask questions as an herbalist is at least the way that modern day herbalists use gravel root, use Joe Pye weed, doesn't really line up with being a typhus remedy. Now, maybe he/they knew something we don't. That's highly possible. But what's interesting is there's another closely related plant we usually call boneset today, Eupatorium perfoliatum, that if you go back in the old books, some of the Europeans were also calling Joe Pye weed. And this plant Yeah, this plant is to this day still used medicinally in a similar way for infections. It boosts an immune response, fevers, intermittent fevers, malaria-like fevers, and could conceivably be something quite useful for something like typhus. So that's been interesting as I've delved further into that. And to talk about boneset, that plant a little bit more, another whole community of people that often gets overlooked is the contributions of enslaved people to herbal medicine. And equally, names have been erased from history, right? But both bringing their own wisdom and knowledge from Africa and combining that with the local native plants. There was a lot more openness, I'm generalizing here, but a lot more openness early on the part of enslaved people, enslaved Africans here. And there were slaves here, by the way, right? Not in the large scale plantations that there were down south, but it's important for us to recognize that there certainly were slaves in our area as well. And there was a lot more openness to interacting with and learning from the wisdom of native peoples here than there were among white Europeans until a little bit later, which I'll talk about. When Europeans first got here, with some real exceptions, with some important individual exceptions, John Jocelyn was one of those, they weren't that interested. They just thought like, oh, these people don't have anything to offer. We've got our medicine. They just brought it all from Europe with them. So early colonial history is mostly about kind of a dismissiveness towards native flora and native herbal medicine, and more just like, we're just bringing our seeds and our plants with us because we've got what we need. And it only kind of came later that people started more broadly paying more attention. And this is from Leah Penniman, who's a African-American herbalist, just pointing out that it was often illegal to practice herbal medicine among enslaved people, and certainly to read and write or write down that information, right, and pass it on in that form. So that's important to recognize as well. And leaving our time frame for a little bit, just because individual names of African-American herbalists during the time of slavery is, I don't want to say impossible, but maybe next to impossible because of all those challenges. Here's a couple people just to mention quickly. This is one of the most fascinating people in the history of herbal medicine in our broader region. This is in New Jersey. James Still, known as the Black Doctor of the Pines, down in southern New Jersey in the Pine Barrens. And he was the son of escaped slaves. His parents both escaped separately from a plantation in Maryland, years apart from each other. The family was split up, had to reunite decades later. He was the brother of William Still, who's often known as the father of the Underground Railroad, really important in the history. Probably nobody tops Harriet Tubman, but after that, he's pretty high up there in the importance in the history of that. So a really amazing family. And James Still became both wealthy and famous and prominent as an herbalist, essentially. He wanted to go to medical school. He decided when he was 3 years old that he wanted to go to medical school. And then he writes in his memoir, which you can find online if you want to read it, that as he got older, of course, he realized he was never going to be admitted to medical school. Right. So he found a bookshop in Philadelphia, bought an herb book, and away he went and became prominent, wealthy, treated a lot of white patients. So actually they would come to his defense when there were legal attempts to put him out of business. So really fascinating person. And by the way, vegetable just used to mean plant. So if you're wondering, he's not just talking about kale. Think animal, mineral, vegetable, right? Just another one briefly, again, because there are often we can't name the names. George Tan actually mentioned in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. It's because my wife and daughter read those books so much. And then when we were out at a museum in Minnesota, I was like, oh, they describe him as an eclectic physician, which, without getting into the details, those are signals to an herbalist that he was an herbalist. That's what that means. And treated malaria. We don't often think about malaria in North America. Malaria was quite the problem in North America. Malaria is a disease of poverty, poor sanitation, unclean water. It's not a tropical disease per se at all, right? We kind of can mistakenly think of it that way. But anyway, there's George Tan. So let's circle back to John Josselyn. And by the way, you're going to hear some names from colonial history that are very familiar to you coming up. So like I mentioned, John Josselyn was one of the first Englishmen to really write down a detailed account of the plants that he was finding here. And he drew some of them. And that's a local native plant. I don't know if anyone recognizes it from his drawing, but that's jewelweed, sometimes called touch-me-not. He called it hummingbird tree. Tree meant something else to him back then, right? But that's clearly jewelweed. He did a pretty good job with the shape and structure of the flowers. And he writes about the medicinal uses as well. In some accounts, he was denounced as an herbalist by the English because he wasn't a physician who graduated from the fancy schools. So it was like, who's this guy over here? But pretty early accounts, not just of plants, but of animal life and so on. And one thing that he wrote in 1672 was about spruce. And this is repeated multiple times in early history of Europeans arriving here. They would arrive with scurvy, right? They would arrive with a severe vitamin C deficiency. They had no idea about vitamin C. And they also early on had no idea what to do about it. Native American peoples they encountered repeatedly, again, this is just one of the accounts, knew what to do about it, right? Without necessarily knowing the biochemistry of ascorbic acid or anything like that, right? They knew what was going on, that it was a deficiency and what plants would cure that. And spruce, our local conifers, are one of those. The needles of conifers are very high in vitamin C. You don't want to take them year round because they're high in tannins. That's kind of a separate if anyone has a question about that. But if you need a good strong boost, really good concentrated source. So he writes here, the tops of the green spruce boughs boiled in bear and drunk, we don't need to do it that way today, is assuredly one of the best remedies for the scurvy, restoring the infected party in a short time. I think it's like bear fat probably he's talking about. Yeah, he doesn't say there, but it's I'm guessing that's what he means, yeah. Here we go with someone else in the history of botany that's very well known. Peter, often referred to as Peter Kalm, Perkalm. He was Swedish and actually helped. I don't know if anyone's familiar, but the Swedes tried to get in on the action, right? We think about the English, of course, the Dutch first, earlier, the French were in on it, of course, the Spanish, but some of the other smaller European countries, it wasn't as if they were enlightened saying like, let's not colonize. They were trying, they just weren't successful. And the Swedes had multiple colonies here in what's now the United States. There's a town in southern New Jersey called Swedesboro, which is a remnant of the colony that Peter Kalm was involved in. But he was a disciple of Carl Linnaeus. We don't have time to get too into that, but some of you might be familiar, really important in the history of botany and biology in general and the taxonomy systems we use today. He spent time here in what's now the United States, studying plants, sending samples back to his mentor Linnaeus in Europe to be cataloged. And of course, the plant, anyone recognize the plant on the right? That's a mountain laurel. Anyone know the scientific name? Calmia, right? So it's Linnaeus named it for him to honor him. Now, as far as we know, the native name, I'm looking to confirm this though, because I'm not totally confident yet, but there's a town here in our county called Ulen, right, over by Eldred, which at least locally is described as the Lenape name for mountain laurel. I just want to confirm that. But that's Peter Kalm.
What's he holding?
Yeah, it looks like a Brillo pad. He's doing the dishes and he paused. I don't know what he's holding yet. Here's something from Peter Kalm. Some of you might know the word Katniss coming from Hunger Games. I do archery now because my daughter was like, during the Hunger Games craze of archery, was like, let's do archery. So I've stuck with it. And there's a plant that we have here locally that grows in our wetlands, Sagittaria or arrowhead. And the roots, the little tubers they produce, are edible and nutritious. And that's Katniss. So the main character from those Hunger Game movies is named for this plant. But that's just a description that Peter Kalm has here, and talking at the end there about how it's superior to the European species because it's got this little edible tuber that it produces, which the European one does not. Sometimes called duck potato. Going to England just for a second to frame something, of course, another group of people that we can, without intentionality, leave out of history is the contribution that women make to herbal medicine. And when it's herbal medicine, that's the vast majority of it, I would say, to be honest, but certainly a huge contribution. And this is from the time period we're talking about, but over in England, this is a very important piece of medical history broadly, not just herbal medicine history, if you're just studying the history of medicine. William Withering wrote this essay, an account of the foxglove and some of its medical uses. Foxglove, highly poisonous, right? One of our most poisonous plants, but it is medicine. Not that we should ever use it anymore, but there are pharmaceuticals, digitoxin, for instance, which are derived from foxglove, which are really important in late-stage heart failure. But they're very, specific, carefully used, potentially very dangerous drugs. But here within the account, you see what William Withering wrote. He didn't figure this out, right? So I was told it had long been kept a secret by an old woman in Shropshire who had sometimes made cures after the more regular practitioners had failed. So that word regular at the time, which also was in use here in the colonies and beyond, actually, into a little bit post-War of Independence, regular meant if you went to the proper school and had a degree. And the irregulars were the community herbalists. What would you say? Yeah, well, certainly including natives and Native American peoples and African Americans and anybody or poor white people as well, for that matter, right? Anyone who didn't have access to that. But at least, even though it's like, come on, give us her name, right? But at least he's admitting he didn't figure it out, right? It's like partial credit, maybe. And this conflict was brought over here to the United States too. So this is a really important person in our local history. Jane Colden lived in nearby in Orange County, the area of Monroe, Newburgh. And she is not recognized often enough as really the first female botanist in terms of post-colonization, right? We want to be careful about wording it that way too. And if she had been a man, like there's no doubt that she'd be more well known. She was the first one to write a flora of New York State, and she drew the plants, right? Often we think of John Torrey as like a century later or 70 years later as being the first one to do that. She really was the first one. It remained unpublished. But she was in correspondence with Ben Franklin and John Bartram and well-known botanists of the time, and was recognized, at least by many of them, for what she was out there doing. There was a little bit of an effort at the time, actually, to have Linnaeus, who, I don't know who put him in charge, but he put himself in charge, for naming one of our local plants there on the lower left, that's Coptis trifolium, that's gold thread, if you're familiar with it, which does have medicinal uses. There was a little bit of an effort to have that named for her and called Colonial. It never happened, but maybe we could we'll change that. Yeah, yeah. We can call it what we want, right? And she did include medicinal uses quite extensively, because back then, a botanist and an herbalist were not two different things, right? They really were part and parcel of the same thing in most cases. It's very hard to get a copy of this, and I haven't yet found a digitized copy. So keep on the lookout. But if you get on like used book sites to, you're going to pay big money to get a copy of this. So hopefully it will be republished is really the solution to that. She was the daughter, by the way, of a very well-known person in New York history. I think I have is it Cadwallader Colden, right? I don't know if I'm pronouncing his first name right, but he was the colonial governor. You're familiar, Donna? He was the colonial governor of New York. They did own slaves on their land here and, next door in Orange County. I don't know if I'm pointing towards Orange County or not.